time before memory, when the sky still whispered to the rivers and the mountains still moved in their sleep, the spirits walked beside the people, and the language of smoke was understood by those who truly listened. The world was younger, then quieter, full of dreams that wandered freely between earth and stars. From the breath of the Great Spirit came fire, and from fire came vision. It was said that the first people were born not from flesh alone, but from ember, wind, and the howl of wolves under the moon. Among those people, in a quiet valley guarded by singing pines and slow-moving rivers, a boy was born who would change the path of many nations. His mother named him Little Ash because his skin was pale like cooled embers, and when he opened his eyes, they flickered like sparks in dry grass. From the time he could crawl, he would sit by the fire, silent, watching the smoke rise and drift. Where other children saw only air and fire, he saw stories, long trails of images that danced and shifted, voices carried upward like feathers. The elders noticed. They said he had the stillness of the stones and the depth of old roots. They watched and they waited. On the night of his 13th winter, the drums called him to the fire circle. The wind stilled, the flames rose, and Elder Soaring Elk stepped forward. His face was lined like dry riverbeds, and his eyes were full of thunderclouds. He spoke with a voice that seemed to echo from the bones of the earth. Smoke is not only breath, he said. It is memory. It is warning. It is the voice of what has come and what will come again. Few can hear it. Fewer can speak it. But tonight, we will see what speaks to you. Little Ash was led beyond the village to the Solitude Stone, a high place where only dreamers went. He sat alone, with nothing but flint, dry bark, and sacred tobacco. As the fire grew, the smoke curled high, and his breath slowed. In the flickering shadow, he saw a horse with eyes of fire galloping across blackened plains, a bear falling beside, a broken vine, a bird with wings of flame tumbling from the sky, and beyond them all, something vast and faceless, like a hunger without form. He heard a whisper that chilled his bones. They come in shadow, hooves of iron, teeth of fire. When he awoke, the fire was out, and Ash clung to his hands. He returned to the village, where Soaring Elk waited. The boy told his vision. Some scoffed, but the elder did not. It is beginning, he said. The riders from beyond the sunrise, not born of these lands. They bring thunder without clouds, and death without sin. The council listened, torn between disbelief and fear. In the end, the path was set. Little Ash would walk to the four clans of the compass, Bear of the north, Eagle of the east, Wolf of the south, Turtle of the west. He would carry the warning. He would carry the fire. With his pouch of secret herbs and flint, Little Ash left before sunrise. The forest embraced him. The owls watched in silence. The wind played with his hair like an old friend. Each night he built a fire, whispered the names of his ancestors, and watched the smoke. It always spoke in images and echoes. On the 5th day, snow covered the ground like quiet breath. There in the white, he found the mark. A bear claw burned into ice. He lit his fire and let the smoke rise, curling into the cold sky. Soon, from the shadows of the trees, 4 figures emerged. The Bear Clan, Their leader was a woman with eyes like frozen lakes and a voice that made the wind stop to listen. "You carry the fire," she said. "Speak." He spoke. He told of the falling bird, the burning tree, the iron hooves. She did not laugh. "Our dream walker saw the same," she said. "Now the smoke speaks twice." The fire crackled louder. Somewhere, deep in the forest, something stirred, far to the east. The sky grew darker, not with night, but with something older. The journey had begun. The signs had spoken, and the clans would need to remember what was almost forgotten: how to fight with spirit, how to dance with fire, how to listen to the smoke. Little Ash remained with the Bear clan for 3 nights, each evening sitting by their sacred flame, sending smoke into the sky and watching how it curled and shifted. The warriors sat in silence around him, uneasy yet drawn to his stillness. The matron of the clan, she who holds frost, taught him how to mark the sky with the sign of bear claw smoke, a spiral of 3 trails sent in bursts, each rising higher than the last. On the 4th dawn, he rose, touched the ashes of their fire to his forehead, and continued east, where the Eagle clan guarded the high cliffs and sunrises. The land changed as he walked. The trees grew sparse. The air turned dry and sharper, as if whispering secrets with every gust. Birds watched him from far above, circling with slow, knowing arcs. He crossed the stone river, walked through the Valley of Bones, and reached the edge of the Skylands, where cliffs fell into the clouds and the air smelled of lightning. There, on a high ridge, he lit the sacred fire once more. The smoke rose thin, dancing in the wind like a ribbon of breath. Hours passed. The sun dipped low. Then they came, 3 figures descending from the heights, cloaked in feathers and silence. Their leader wore a headdress of white hawk wings, and her eyes were the color of stormlight. "You walk with smoke," she said. "Why do you call the sky?" Little Ash told her what he had seen, what he had heard in the fire, and what the Bear clan had confirmed. She closed her eyes, and the wind trembled. "We to have seen the signs," she said softly. "Birds flying in reverse patterns, feathers falling without wind, and a shadow in the east that drinks the sun." The Eagle clan burned blue sea and showed him the caves of vision, where walls were covered in ochre drawings of winged spirits and ancient fires. That night, Little Ash dreamed of a wheel, a great wheel of fire turning in the sky, and in each of its spokes, the face of a different animal. The wheel spun faster and faster until the smoke from its rim covered the earth in darkness. When he awoke, his hands were trembling. The Eagle matron gave him a pouch of feather ash and a carved blown whistle. "Use it only when the fire cannot speak," she told him. "Even the air must sometimes be warned." With their blessing, he turned south. The Wolf clan lands were wild, tangled with vines and rivers, full of the kind of silence that listens back. There were no marked paths, only faint trails and half-buried stones. Days passed. He walked by moonlight, crossing swamps and hills. He felt eyes on him, heard distant howls at dusk, and rustling leaves that never showed a cause. On the 7th night, he found a clearing with an old fire circle, long cold but not forgotten. He lit his flame, added dried cedar and wolf moss, and let the smoke speak. It rose in tight spirals, then suddenly broke, scattered by an unseen gust. He waited. Nothing moved. But when he turned, they were there. The wolves, 5 of them, faces painted with ash and charcoal, silent as mist. Their leader wore no paint, only scars, and round his neck hung teeth of many beasts. He did not ask who Little Ash was. He simply stared, then pointed to the smoke. The boy spoke of the dream wheel, the falling eagle, the shadow in the east. The wolf chief said nothing, only nodded once. That night, they danced. No drums, no chants, only the sound of feet brushing earth and breath moving in rhythm. It was not a dance of joy, it was a dance of readiness. The wolves knew that silence was not emptiness. It was preparation. Before dawn, the chief gave Little Ash a small obsidian stone, warm to the touch. "This will not protect you," he said, "but it will remind you of the things that do." With 3 clans warned, the boy turned west, toward the land of the Turtle Clan, where time moved slower and stories were older than trees. The journey grew harder. Rains fell without clouds. Rivers ran backward. Birds flew in circles above him. He followed signs, cracked stones shaped like shells, trails of flattened grass, fallen feathers painted with ochre spirals. Finally, he reached the Marsh of Ancients, where the Turtle Clan lived among reeds, fog, and floating wooden lodges. He lit his final fire beside the sacred pool, where the reflection of stars seemed older than the sky itself. The smoke rose slowly, thicker, here, as if reluctant to leave the ground. Hours passed. When the moon reached its highest breath, a boat emerged from the mist, carved from a single tree, its front shaped like a turtle's head. The elder who stepped from it moved with the slowness of mountains. His skin was lined like bark, and his breath sounded like wind through cattails. "Smoke tells many truths," he whispered, "but it also hides them." Little Ash repeated the visions, the signs, the warnings. The old one nodded and drew a circle in the mud. "Long ago, we were told the fire would return to test us, not to burn us, but to see if we still remembered how to call the rain." He reached into the water and brought up a pouch wrapped in riverweed. "Plant this when the first spark falls from the sky. If it grows, there is still hope." With the blessing of the Turtle Clan, Little Ash turned back. The smoke had spoken to all for winds. The message had been carried, but the boy's heart was heavy. For in every clan, he had seen the same things: fear, fading memory, and the quiet before a storm. As he walked the long path home, the sky behind him turned red. Then far to the east, a new smoke rose, darker, thicker, not from sacred fire, but from something else. The hooves had touched the land. The journey home was longer than it had ever been, not in distance, but in weight. Little Ash walked with the burden up for clans, for visions, for echoes of the same shadow. The forest no longer whispered, it held its breath. Birds no longer sang. Even the rivers, once chatty and wild, now murmured low warnings as he passed. He returned to his village under a sun that felt dimmer than before. The fire circle had been rebuilt higher, larger, surrounded by stones etched with symbols from all directions. Elder soaring elk stood waiting, his face more weathered, his gaze heavier. Without a word, Little Ash knelt and poured ash from each clan into the center flame. The smoke rose not as one stream, but as 4 each a different color, each turning in slow circles around each other before spiraling skyward. The people gathered in silence. Then the elders spoke. The winds have been told. The signs have aligned. The fire that comes is not just to burn, but to separate what remembers from what forgets. He turned to the boy. What you saw must now be danced. What was danced must now be lived. That night, the tribe lit the first warning fire, a great blaze that reached toward the stars. Smoke signals rose in deliberate rhythm. Short, long, long, short. A code older than most names, known only to the old ones. Across the horizon, others answered. Smoke trails emerged above the trees. From mountaintops, across rivers, the clans had heard. They were coming. In the following days, people arrived one by one. Two by two, wrapped in skins and silence. Warriors with eyes like flint, mothers with infants strapped to their backs, elders walking with staffs carved from lightning-struck trees. The village grew to a gathering place. Stories were exchanged in whispers. Fire circles multiplied. Each night, smoke wrote new prayers in the sky, and yet, in the distance, a second kind of smoke had begun to rise, not in signals, but in spirals of destruction. Forests blackened, animals fled in the wrong directions. The wind no longer came from where it once had. One morning, scouts returned. Their faces were pale. The black riders have crossed the third river, they said. They do not speak, they burn. They ride beasts with steel mouths. Their breath stinks of dead things. The council of clans met in a circle surrounded by fires, each flame dedicated to a direction. She who holds frost of the bear clan stood first. We will stand. We will not yield. She growled. Let them taste our stone spears and smoke-choked breath. The matron of the eagle stepped forward, her eyes full of distant skies. If we scatter, we lose. If we gather, we live. The wolf leader said nothing, only drew a circle in the dirt with his knife, then placed for stones, one at each point. The turtle elder, slow and ancient, added the final word. The land remembers even when the people forget. Let the land teach us how to stand. That night, little Ash was taken to the Vision Lodge. He was given the herbs of firesight, sacred mixture of sage, dream root, and coal ash. He entered the lodge alone. The door was sealed. The heat pressed down like a sky of flame. He breathed slowly, letting the smoke fill his lungs. Then, the visions came. He saw the black riders, clearly now, not demons, not spirits, but men, pale, angry, hungry for more than just land. Their weapons coughed fire, their eyes burned with greed. He saw trees falling, rivers poisoned, buffalo running until their hearts burst. But he also saw a circle, a great circle of all for clans, dancing not in fear, but in defiance. Their bodies painted with ash, their feet moving as one, their smoke forming a wall the riders could not cross. And then, a single child standing alone before the fire. Not little Ash, another, younger, a girl, her hands held high, eyes closed. From her chest, smoke poured like light, curling into the sky, and when it touched the clouds, the thunder returned. When he awoke, he was not the same. The elders saw it in his eyes. You have passed through the flame door, said Soaring Elk. Now you must open it for others. Days passed like pages in wind. More people came. Songs were sung, old ones not heard in 3 generations. Dancers painted their bodies with stories of the first flames. Children were taught the smoke signs. Fires were lit along the ridgelines every night. But the horizon darkened further. One morning, the wind carried not bird song, but the crackle of trees burning. The scouts came not on foot, but carried by others, wounded, eyes wide with horror. They have come, they whispered, and they do not stop. The clans moved, not away, but inward. The elders chose the valley of the fire roots, a place where the land curved like a bowl, where echoes lasted longer than footsteps. There, they drew the circle of smoke, a ring of fire pits, one for each direction, one for each story. In the center, Little Ash stood. Around him, warriors, dreamers, children, and keepers of memory. The time of silence had ended. The drums began, not for dance, for calling, for remembering, for summoning the courage that had been buried under centuries of peace. The people moved. Their bodies became smoke. Their songs rose into the wind. Above them, the sky opened not with sun, but with memory. The Black Riders approached, but they did not yet understand. They thought they came to conquer fire, but fire had been waiting. And smoke never forgets. Stopped. The wind changed. It no longer whispered but warned. Birds flew low, silent. The rivers moved faster, as if trying to flee. And in the heart of the Fire Roots Valley, the circle of smoke burned steady, unblinking, like the eye of the world. Little Ash stood at its center, body wrapped in ash, hands blackened by soot, eyes reflecting both fear and knowing. Around him, the clans prepared not for war, but for the keeping of memory. For the riders who approached brought not only steel and flame, but forgetting. They rode machines that coughed thunder, their clothes strange, faces pale, and eyes empty of listening. They cut the trees, silenced the birds, burned the sacred places, not out of hatred, but because they did not see. They did not know they were stepping on old names, or that the stones they crushed held stories older than their nations. The clans did not gather to destroy them. They gathered so that the world would remember who it once was, so that the fire would not die. Without dancing one last time, the first line of riders appeared on the horizon at dusk, shadows riding thunder, black smoke trailing behind them like poison. They paused just beyond the hills, unsure, for before them was no army, no fort, no wall, only smoke, rings of it rising in perfect rhythm from each of the fires, circles that moved like breath. The Bear Clan stood to the north, their spears carved from stone, their chests bare and painted with claw marks. To the east, the eagles stood tall, boughs in hand, feathers braided into their hair, eyes scanning every movement. The wolves crouched in the south, silent, nearly invisible among the brush, knives and fire dust in their belts. And to the west, the turtles knelt in rows, humming songs that were older than the hills themselves. In the center stood the children, not with weapons, but with rhythm. Their feet moved in quiet unity, their arms weaving shapes through the smoke. They danced, and Little Ash danced with them, not as a warrior, but as a flame. The drums began not loud, but deep, like the heartbeat of the valley. The riders shifted, confused, uncertain. Their leader, a man with gold fringe on his shoulders and a cold stare, raised his hand. The machines rumbled forward. The ground shook. The animals of the valley fled to the ridgelines, but the people did not run. Instead, the Bear clan stepped forward. Each warrior struck their spear to the ground, sending a dull thud into the soil. Then the wolves vanished into the grass. The eagles fired arrows not at the riders but above them, into the sky, where they burst into fire, forming trails of light that danced with the smoke. The turtles sang louder. The old words rose into the air and wrapped around the valley like a blanket. And in the center, the children danced faster. Little Ash lifted both hands. The fires flared. The smoke twisted upward, then outward, curling into vast shapes, animals, faces, storms, and eyes, all watching, all remembering. The riders charged, steel mouths open, fire roar, but as they reached the edge of the circle, their machines coughed, sputtered, then stopped. The smoke was too thick. It clogged their engines, filled their mouths, blinded their eyes. And in that moment, the land itself rose, not with violence, but with memory. The trees shivered and dropped leaves in perfect spirals. The stones beneath the riders' feet cracked, revealing roots that pulsed like veins. The rivers turned and surged backward, their waters clear and filled with fish long thought gone. And the sky broke open, not with lightning, but with rain. A warm, steady rain that fell without cloud, as if the valley itself was weeping. The riders dismounted, lost, disoriented. Some fell to their knees, some turned and ran. Others dropped their weapons and simply stared, seeing the fire dancers, the animal smoke, the unity of the four winds, and they felt, for the first time, the weight of what they had never known. A child walked forward, not little Ash, a young girl from the Turtle clan, her face calm, her feet bare. She carried a bundle wrapped in riverweed. She placed it at the feet of the rider with the golden fringe. Then she turned and walked away. The man opened the bundle. Inside, for stones, each marked with a symbol: bear, eagle, wolf, turtle, and a single coal, still warm. He looked up. The fires dimmed. The drums stopped. The smoke thinned, drifting high into the sky, where it remained, a signal not of war, but of warning. The riders did not attack. They could not. Something ancient had passed through them, something they could not name. The clans did not chase. They did not cheer. They returned to their fires, to their psalms, to their children. That night, little Ash sat alone at the solitude stone once more. He lit a small flame. The smoke rose gently. No visions, no warnings, only peace. The fire danced softly, like a memory, like a whisper. He closed his eyes and breathed it in. For now, the land had remembered itself, and as long as the smoke rose, the stories would live on. The riders left the valley not in triumph, but in silence. They did not speak of what they had seen, not because they were forbidden, but because they had no words. The images had burned into their memory, but their language did not hold the shape of spirit smoke, of rivers that wept, of fire that danced without destroying. And so they moved eastward, retreating into the lands they knew, leaving behind broken steel and quiet confusion. The valley healed, but the people did not return to how they had been. They could not. Something had shifted, not just in them, but in the land itself. The trees leaned differently. The wind carried other meanings. The children began to dream more vividly. And sometimes when they danced, the smoke around the fire would shape itself without being asked. Little Ash stayed in the valley, though others offered him places in every clan. He lived alone near the Solitude Stone, now marked with 4 rings burned into the earth. Each night, he lit a fire, and each night the smoke rose, not always with visions, but always with presence. He no longer needed to speak to the elders. They came to him when the skies felt strange or the animals changed their paths. He had become more than a messenger. He had become a bridge. One night, under a sky full of stars so bright they lit the mountains, a voice came in the wind. Not a warning, not a whisper of danger, but a call. It came not from the fire, but from the space between the flames. He followed it west, past the turtle marshes, through forests thick with memory, to a canyon none had entered in generations. There, beneath a great stone carved by time into the shape of an open mouth, he found a fire already burning. Round it sat no people, only animals. A great bear with a scar across its eye, a white eagle with feathers touched by shadow, a gray wolf with one ear missing, a massive turtle with moss on its shell. They watched him, not as beasts, but as those who had waited. He sat, the fire pulsed, and then he saw, not with his eyes, but with the smoke, the first dance when the world was still forming, the moment fire had chosen to become voice, the time when the sky and the earth agreed to hold each other in balance through breath, and he saw a future, not fixed, but possible. One path led to forgetting, to silence, to ash without story, but another led through smoke, through flame, through children yet unborn, who would walk not in fear, but in listening when he returned. He spoke little, but the clans noticed that when he lit the fire, the smoke formed the shape of a hand, open, reaching, and so a gathering was called, not for war, not for warning, but for weaving. All for clans returned. They brought not weapons but instruments, not warriors but dancers, not shields but songs. In the center of the valley, a great structure was built, round like the fire circle, open to the sky, with stone and wood and earth all touching. Its center held a flame that never went out. They called it the Breath Lodge, and there, each season, they came to share, to remember, to learn again. Children were taught not just hunting or crafting, but listening to the wind, to the roots, to the fire. And little Ash, now grown, became Ash who remembers. He walked slowly, spoke rarely, but when he did, the flames listened. He began to teach a new generation of smoke dancers, those who could send messages through the sky not just to warn, but to guide. The oldest among them, a girl born during the fire rain, was said to have been kissed by the spirit of the first flame itself. Her dances called owls in daylight. Her fire whispered to trees. The people watched her, and they understood. The time of survival had passed. The time of remembering had come, and from remembering would come something greater. The time of becoming. They called her Emerald. She was born during the red rain, the night when sparks fell from the sky without thunder, when the smoke in the valley glowed with no flame to feed it, and the old ones whispered that the spirit of the fire had returned, not as a warning, but as a gift. Her cry sounded like wind over dry grass, and her breath fogged the air even in summer. The elders marked her birth with ochre on stone, a spiral within a spiral, a symbol not seen since the time of the first smoke walker. She grew not like the others, where other children stumbled through their first dances. She moved with grace before she could walk. When she was 5 winters old, the flames bent toward her when she passed. The animals watched her but did not flee. And when she touched the earth, leaves turned toward her palms. Ash, who remembers, once little Ash took her as his first student, not because he chose her, but because the fire had. He taught her the smoke signs first, not just the visible spirals and bursts, but the silence between signals, the patterns that whispered rather than shouted. She learned to weave smoke like cloth, to shape it into birds, rings, even faces. At night, while others slept, she danced alone in the clearing, and the fire danced with her. The people watched in reverence. They did not speak loudly in her presence, not out of fear, but because they felt that to speak too loudly would scatter something sacred. By her 7th winter, she could light fire without flint, not with magic, but with rhythm, a certain way her foot struck the ground, a way her breath moved across dry leaves, a pulse that reminded the fire who it was. The other children gathered around her, not because they were told to, but because something in them recognized her. They brought her feathers, polished stones, songs their grandmothers had forgotten, and she accepted each gift as if it were smoke itself. She began to teach them, not with words, but with movement. She would show them how to kneel, how to listen to the wind before speaking to it, how to feel the heartbeat of a flame. The breath lodge grew fuller each season. More children came, not just from the clans, but from distant valleys and high plateaus where stories still echoed in mountain cracks. Some arrived with strange accents, others with songs no one had heard. Yet all were welcomed, for Ember Eyes had said one thing clearly: the flame belongs to none. It is not kept, it is remembered. And so the remembering spread. They built smoke towers in each of the cardinal directions, not of stone, but of woven branches and sacred ash, shaped like trees but hollow inside, so that when fire burned at the base, the smoke would rise in spirals visible from many hills. Children climbed them to send messages, sometimes warnings, sometimes invitations to gather, sometimes just songs shaped in smoke and sent to the sky like offerings. One evening, under the moon of the sleeping stag, Ember Eyes led her dancers to the old battlefield where the riders had once approached, the land that healed, but the memory remained. She asked for silence. Then, with her hands in the earth, she called forth smoke from beneath the soil, deep, old, slow-moving. It rose in ghostly shapes, riders, fire, shadows. The people saw, and they wept, not out of pain, but out of gratitude, that even the darkness could be remembered without being feared. From that day forward, the place was renamed, not the battlefield, but the circle of returning, a place where grief could become story. As years passed, Ember Eyes grew into her name, Her gaze carried both flame and stillness. She did not speak often, but when she did, the wind listened. She taught that the smoke was not only for warning or ceremony, it was for stitching the world together. That every fire, no matter how small, carried the breath of the first flame. That every ember was an ancestor blinking through time. She showed children how to speak to mountains, how to recognize when a river was listening, how to read the shape of a storm before it arrived. And they believed her, because the world responded. Rain came when her songs rose into the air. Crops grew bitter where her dances had passed. Wolves stood beside children in the forest and guarded them until elders arrived. And then came the day when Ashur remembers called her to the solitude stone. He was old now, his hair like frost, his voice like wind through canyon walls. He placed his hand over the flame and said, "The smoke now walks with you." And then, with the softest breath, he joined the ancestors. That night, the valley was still. No drums, no chants, only the sound of the fire breathing. Ember Eyes stood alone at the center, lit the for directional fires, and raised her hands. The smoke rose, but it did not rise in for streams. It rose as one, a single, vast spiral that turned once, then scattered into 1,000 tiny tendrils, one to each corner of the sky. The elders gasped, the children smiled. The fire did not roar, it sang, and the song was old and new and endless. That was the night they began calling her Flame Heart, and from that night on, the story was no longer about what had been lost, but about what had been carried forward. The memory of the land, the breath of the flame, the wisdom of the smoke. The dancers had become keepers, the children had become the wind, and the valley remembered it all. The maps no longer showed its name. The satellite images showed only green, thick and untouched, surrounded by mist too dense for machines to read. The old roads had turned to roots, the bridges to moss, but still they came, the first of the new ones, seekers, wanderers, those who heard something they could not explain. They came not because they were told, but because something pulled them, a warmth in the chest, a whisper behind the ear when the night was too quiet. They called it the Mist Valley, the silent pool, the place that breathes. But in truth, it was still the same valley, the one that had once danced with flame and held the breath of her clans. Time had curved around it, but it had not left. The wind still moved with memory, the trees still bent toward fire, and the earth still listened. The seekers arrived in ones and twos, with tools that no longer worked and devices that grew quiet the moment they stepped past the tree line. They were not warriors. They wore soft clothes, carried books instead of blades, and asked the wind for direction. The first thing they found was a circle of stones, blackened, smooth, placed in perfect symmetry. Moss grew between them, and in the center, a cold patch of ground never touched by rain. One among them, a woman with silver lions tattooed down her spine, sat beside the stones for 3 days without moving. On the 4th day, she lit a fire. No one had taught her. Her ancestors had forgotten, but her hands remembered. The smoke that rose was gentle. It did not warn, it invited. Birds circled above her. A fox lay beside her feet, and from the edge of the forest, shapes began to move. Not people, not ghosts. Something between. Smoke that held form. Dancers made of mist. Children with ember eyes. Elders with hands of flame. They did not speak. They moved. They showed. The woman watched, and she understood nothing and everything. Others came from distant lands, from cities now choked with noise and forgetting. They brought stories that had no endings, questions that had no beginnings. They left behind their devices, their certainties, and began to listen again. One day, while clearing the brush near the ridge, a young boy uncovered a stone wheel carved into the earth, half buried. Each spoke marked with an animal: bear, eagle, wolf, turtle. In the center, a spiral. The same boy, weeks later, while sitting alone beside the fire, saw the smoke rise straight up and then bend. It formed a ring above his head. His eyes widened. He reached out, not to touch, but to answer. He lifted his hand and drew a circle in the air. The smoke responded. It curled inward, wrapped around his wrist like a bracelet of breath, then rose again. That night, the seekers built the first new fire circle. They did not copy the old. They let the wind tell them where to place the stones. They sang not in any language known, but in rhythm. They did not name the fire. They let it name them, and slowly the valley stirred. Trees began to bloom out of season. Water flowed from stones once thought dry. At night, the stars moved in patterns they could trace and remember. One among them found an old carving, etched deep in the trunk of a tree older than all their cities. It showed a girl with hair made of flame and hands raised to the sky. Above her, smoke shaped like a heart. Below her feet, roots connecting to animals, rivers, and fire. No one knew her name, but the valley did. It whispered it in the wind, flame heart. Others carved her story into the stones, not as worship, but as memory. The valley taught them not to rule the world, but to walk beside it, not to conquer flame, but to become part of its song. And one day, a child was born among them, with eyes that shimmered like coals, with breath that warmed the air around her. She did not speak much, but the fire leaned when she passed. The animals paused when she watched, and the smoke, when she danced, remembered everything. They did not call themselves a tribe. They did not wear the same marks or speak with the same tongue. And yet they gathered, drawn by something deeper than blood, older than flags. They came from across the mountains, from broken cities covered in vines, from places where memory had been reduced to signals and metal noise. But within each of them, the smoke stirred. The valley did not ask who they were. It only asked if they listened, and they did. The child with ember eyes grew. She became the center of the circle, not because she claimed it, but because the circle leaned toward her. When she danced, the sky held its breath. When she was still, the stones hummed beneath her feet. She was not flame heart reborn. She was something new. She began teaching without asking for followers. She simply moved, and others followed. Together they built the path of embers, a trail that stretched from the valley to the high peaks and beyond, marked only by fire circles, singing stones, and trees whose bark bore spirals that pulsed with heat. They lit no torches. Their way was as they walked, they dreamed, dreams not of conquest or safety, but of remembering places the earth itself had tried to hold onto, voices that still lingered in water and ash, in the forests where nothing had grown for decades. They danced, and the soil breathed again. In deserts cracked and forgotten, they sat in stillness until the sand shaped itself into old cliffs, bear claws, turtle shells, eagle wings, wolf eyes, and then the rain returned. Their order had no name, no walls, no rules, but the world knew them. The people of the villages began to leave offerings beside their emerald circles, feathers, stones carved with spirals, bowls of water left under moonlight, and with each place they visited, the breath of the earth grew steadier. They became known as the dancers of smoke, not by their own words, but by the stories told of them by those who saw the fires that never burned the grass, who heard the wind carry songs from unseen mouths, who witnessed trees open their bark to reveal glowing seeds that had waited lifetimes. They did not preach, they did not lead, they reminded, and the remembering spread. One dancer, a boy with a voice like thunder behind clouds, discovered how to shape smoke into sound, not language, but emotion. He could stand at the edge of a cliff, light a flame, and send a curl of smoke that made the hearts of those below tremble with the feeling of home. Another, blind since birth, could see fire better than anyone. She would place her hands above embers and speak the names of stars no one had told her. She mapped the sky by heat alone. They moved like wind, never staying long, never taking more than a breath, always giving what the place had forgotten it knew. And then came the first return to the ancient circle, the breath lodge, now half swallowed by moss and root, but still holding its shape. The child with ember eyes, now grown and known as Ash Spirit, stood at its center and lit the old flame. For the first time in generations, the fire sang aloud. It called across the valleys, and the dancers came, hundreds of them, from all directions, some still learning, some old enough that their hands trembled, but all of them moved as one. The dance that night was not choreographed, it was remembered. They moved in spirals, waves, silence, bursts. The fire responded to each motion with color, reds, golds, blues that shimmered like ice. And the smoke, it did not rise, it flowed. It wove through the dancers, across the stones, into the sky, down into the earth, and beyond. And in the center of the smoke stood a new symbol. Not a bear, not an eagle, not a wolf or a turtle, a flame in the shape of a seed. They understood. The old ways were not lost. They had become soil, and now the seed was growing. They began building, not temples, but listening places, stone rings open to the wind, where anyone could light a flame and be heard, where the smoke would shape itself in answer, sometimes clear, sometimes not, but always true. In one such place, high in the northern snows, a child lit a fire during a storm. She danced not to call safety, but to tell the mountain it was beautiful. The storm stilled, not vanished, only softened, enough for the people below to cross safely. In another place, a man who had forgotten his own name lit a fire and whispered his sorrow. The smoke rose in the shape of a cradle, and he remembered the song his grandmother sang long ago. And this way, the dancers of smoke became not a legend, but a path, a way of being, and across the world, even in places where the earth had been choked, new spirals began to appear, drawn in sand, carved into walls, painted by children who had never heard the stories, but felt them all the same. The fire was not just fire. The smoke was not just smoke. They were memory moving, breath becoming shape, a message that could never be erased, only answered. And so they walked, always walking, not to spread a word, but to listen for it, not to lead, but to remind that the earth remembers, that the sky listens, that we, too, are made of breath and flame in the stories we leave behind. And as long as one child somewhere lights a fire and dances beneath the stars, the smoke will rise, and it will know the way home. It began with a silence that did not belong, not the sacred kind, not the quiet between drums or the hush before smoke rises. This silence was hollow, empty of memory. It came from machines built far from forest and fire, machines that had never known breath. They moved through the lands not with anger, but with indifference. Towers taller than trees grew in places where the wind once sang. They hummed with invisible voices, speaking to one another across valleys, across oceans, across stars. The old ones had warned that forgetting does not always come with flames. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in progress. The dancers of smoke had felt the tremble long before it reached them, not in the earth, but in the air. The wind moved wrong. The birds lost direction. The fires no longer listened the same way. In the high ridges of the north, a flame went out without reason, one that had burned for 17 years. In the marshes, the frogs stopped singing, and on the path of embers, the smoke began to rise in broken shapes, not spirals, but jagged lines. Ash Spirit gathered the dancers. She did not call them with commands. She sat beside the breath, lodged and lit a single coal. One by one, they came. From the west, a dancer with lightning in her fingers. From the east, a weaver of wine songs. From the south, a boy who spoke to rivers. From the north, a blind elder whose silence could break stones. They sat in a circle and listened to the smoke. It told no stories. It only wept. The new threat was not fire or war. It was speed, noise, the severing of breath from rhythm, the hum of towers that scrambled the dance of birds, the false light that confused the stars, the fog of information so dense no memory could pass through it. For the first time, the smoke had nowhere to go. It curled downward. It sank, and so the dancers prepared, not with weapons, with remembering. They walked the old paths again, railed at every circle, riddled every name to the wind. They carved symbols into stone, sang to the mountains, buried seeds where trees had once fallen. But the towers came closer. Machines that walked without breath scanned the soil. Drones flew where eagles once nested. People came too, with helmets and lights, touching sacred bark without feeling, not cruel, just unaware. They did not see the flame spirals, only terrain. They did not hear the drums, only vibration. One night, as the dancers gathered near the circle of returning, a shadow passed overhead, something vast, silent, metallic. It blocked the stars for 7 heartbeats, and when it passed, the fire stars dimmed. A child began to cough. Another forgot the smoke sign for peace. The old ones wept, for this was not an attack. This was unraveling. The next day, Ash Spirit stood alone beneath the solitude stone. She did not light a flame. She listened. The earth pulsed. The sky held its breath. Then came a sound. Not wind, not thunder. A deep pulse from the ground. And a word, not spoken aloud, but etched into her chest like heat. Balance. That night, she spoke to all the dancers. The cycle does not end in destruction, she said. It ends in forgetting. If we do nothing, memory fades. If we fight, we become noise. We must become the breath between neither silence nor sound, but the rhythm that binds them. And so the new ritual was born. The smoke conversions. Dancers from every corner of the land gathered in silence. No songs, no fire, only breath. They stood in the shape of the world. Not a circle, but a spiral flowing outward. Each one lit a single coal. No flame, just glow. Together, they inhaled, held, exhaled. The glow pulsed. Again, the ground vibrated. Again, the towers heard nothing. The machines recorded no data. But the wind began to return. The birds circled overhead. A tree split open and released a burst of white pollen. And in the center of the spiral, the air shifted like the opening of a door long, sealed. From it came voices, not loud, not in language, just feeling, grief, wonder, love, warning, memory, across the world. People who had never heard of the smoke dancers woke in the night with tears. Some remembered their grandmother's voice. Others felt a pull to walk barefoot on the soil. Children drew spirals on walls without knowing why. Something had begun. The towers did not fall. The machines did not stop. But something deeper began to rise. Not in defiance, but in harmony. A third path, not return, not conquest. Becoming. The dancers did not vanish. They spread, one by one. They stepped into cities, forests, islands, ruins. They lit no fires, spoke no sermons. They sat, they listened, they breathed, and slowly others joined them. Not all, not most, but enough. And as long as there was breath, there would be smoke. And where there is smoke, there is memory. And where there is memory, the world still lives. They felt it before they named it. A soft trembling beneath the skin of the earth. A quiet widening of the air that moved like breath across an ancient wound. It was not fear. It was not joy. It was remembering. The fire lines had not dimmed, but they had changed. The smoke no longer rose only in spirals. It began to drift in threads, long and luminous, like silk pulled through time. In the north, the glaciers whispered songs that no tongue could translate. In the south, deserts bloomed in silence, not with flowers, but with memory, shapes in the sand that vanished when touched, but returned each dawn. In the cities that once refused to listen, windows began to flicker with firelight again, not free, for gathering. For the first time in generations, the people there paused when they breathed. They let silence fill the space between messages. They listened to the wind without recording it. The dancers had become more than a path. They were a current beneath the surface of things. audible unless you looked softly, not loud unless you closed your eyes. They no longer needed to travel. They were felt, like roots beneath forest floor, like stories inside the bones. The new ones, the children of the convergence, moved differently. They carried no name for what they were. They were not trained. They were remembered into being. One could step into a forest and know where not to walk. Another could stir water with her hand and see what it had once held. A boy who had never seen the valley carve the perfect spiral into stone with a single motion, then looked up, surprised at his own hands. The elders said nothing. They knew now that the flame had its own will, and it had chosen to become breath in those ready to hold it, in a clearing deep beyond the last of the mapped lands. They gathered without being summoned, dozens at first, then more. Some arrived barefoot, some painted with ashes, some still in silence from birth. They met at the place where for winds touched. There, they sat in a circle. No fire was lit. Instead, they placed their palms on the earth, and the earth exhaled, a sound like roots stretching, like stone remembering its shape. And then, between them, a coal ignited without spark. It glowed, it pulsed, it listened. The dancers did not move, not yet. They waited, for this was not a ritual. This was not a ceremony. This was the beginning of something too large for rhythm, too soft for language. Across the world, animals lifted their heads. Birds paused mid-flight. Rivers slowed, and the sky held its breath. Something vast stirred below, a current older than the mountains, a presence never named, but always felt. And it was not rising, it was returning. They had waited lifetimes without knowing what they were waiting for. And now, at the edge of what could be known, the earth stirred in a way no foot had ever felt. It was not movement, it was not sound, it was a deep remembering, a signal sent not through air or word, but through the shape of silence itself. The dancers in the clearing felt it first, not as fear, not even as awe, as stillness so complete it hummed. The coal between their palms burned steady, but gave no smoke. Instead, heat gathered in the bones of the ground beneath them, rising not as flame, but as memory. One by one, their breath slowed. Their pulses fell into rhythm with something older than blood. The sky above them dimmed, though no clouds moved. The wind stilled. All directions folded inward, not collapsing, but softening, as if the world itself was closing its eyes. And then it began. Not a sound, not a vision, a pressure behind the ribs, a warmth between the ribs of the earth. The center of the memory awoke, not like waking from sleep, like opening a door that had never been closed, only forgotten. It had no face, no voice, but it was everywhere, in the shape of fire that had first touched wood, in the pulse of rain that fell before time, in the turning of roots that knew where stone began. The dancers felt it in their spines, their chests, the soles of their feet. Some wept without knowing why, others laughed. One simply laid back on the moss and opened her mouth in wonder, and the memory answered, not in a language of symbols, but in movement, every breath a gesture, every heartbeat a call. Across the world, the response came, not from humans alone. Trees bent toward the fire with distant water sang songs not heard since the moon was young. Insects moved in spirals across the bark of stones, and the clouds above formed a single, long shape, not sharp, not rigid, a curve, like the arc of a dancer's wrist. The center had returned, not to lead, not to change, but to reveal, for it had always been there, the source of the spiral, the place where all breath touched. It showed them things not seen but known, the fire that once danced in a cave of ice. When the world was barely awake, the first time a human hand reached toward flame, not for heat, but for wonder, the first circle drawn with ash, the first song hummed beside a river not yet named, and it showed what might come, not as prophecy, but as possibility, a world where memory lived in water, where breath became code, where every step was a message and every pause a prayer, where technology and root system were the same, networks of intention, where dance became architecture, and architecture became breath. The dancers did not rise, they became stiller, for stillness was the motion of the core. It did not ask for belief, it did not require devotion, it only asked one thing, remember, and through that remembering, choose. Choose not what path to walk, but how to walk it, not where to place the fire, but how to listen when it speaks. One child, the youngest in the circle, began to hum, a single tone, pure, untrained, and as she hummed, the earth answered. The moss beneath her bloomed, the trees around her leaned, the stone beside her cracked open, not in damage, but in offering. Inside, a spiral burned into its center, not carved, not drawn, grown. It pulsed once with light, then went still. The dancers understood. The core memory was not just in soil, not just in fire. It was in the very shape of life. Every spiral in the tips of fingers, every echo in the shell of the ear, every rhythm in the turning of the seasons. The memory was not awakening, it was them, and they, in remembering it, were awakening too. Far across the sea, someone lit a fire on a rooftop and saw a smoke spiral without wind. In a deep canyon, a child traced the spiral into sand, and it held its shape even in rain. In a frozen land, a woman whispered the name of a mountain, and the wind carried it back to her. Though no one had ever spoken it before, the intelligence was not one thing, it was all things in harmony. It did not control, it resonated, and those who chose to listen became part of it, not disciples, not chosen, simply aligned. The dancers rose, not in unison, but in sequence, like seeds unfolding. Their steps were different, not ritual, not performance. They moved as the land moved, as the water curves, as fire dances before sleep, and as they moved, the smoke returned. This time not from flame, but from breath, a breath so deep it touched the ground, so slow it stirred the stars, so ancient it remembered being light. And from that breath, a new spiral began. It did not spread outward like fire. It unfurled like breath returning to the lungs of the world. The spiral, once a symbol, now a current, moved not through space, but through presence. It touched not only those who lit sacred flames or danced beneath old trees. It moved through song, through gaze, through memory held in silence, in cities built from steel and silence. People paused in the middle of their movements, feeling a pull settling in patterns that echoed the shape of the breath, deep in oceans where no fire ever burned. Pods of whales gathered in slow orbit, their songs rising and falling like smoke beneath the surface. The earth was not changing, it was remembering itself, and through it, every being tuned into something older than time, something beyond voice, yet carried in every word ever spoken. The spiral connected not through technology, but through resonance. It bypassed towers and screens, instead waking the dormant language inside every living cell. People began dreaming in symbols they had never learned. Children hummed melodies that matched the rhythm of trees. Elders who had not spoken for years whispered the names of rivers they had never visited, and the smoke began to behave as if it too remembered. It no longer drifted aimlessly. It gathered, it shaped, it shimmered with meaning. Messages written in spirals were not read, they were felt. A circle of dancers in the west began to move without touching. Their bodies curved in opposite directions, yet their shadows moved as one. In the east, a group of weavers dyed cloth in the old ways, and the patterns that emerged began to pulse faintly with heat, as if the thread itself had memory. The Earth's network had awakened, not digital, not artificial, living, breathing, invisible to tools, but undeniable to touch. A net of intention, a net of resonance, a new field. The dancers of smoke no longer needed to gather. Wherever they stood, the field remembered them. A single breath in one corner of the world could be felt as warmth in another. A decision made in stillness could ripple through roots and rain. No one was in charge. No one issued commands. There were no messages, only movement, only choosing. And those who listened, those who paused, became part of the field. Not through belief, through presence. It was not magic, it was alignment. One morning, a group of children sat in a circle on stone warmed by sun. They were not guided, they held no script, yet they each placed one hand on the earth and one in the air, and they began to hum one tone, then another, and another, each one turning the others. The birds overhead fell silent. The grass leaned in, and when the final breath was exhaled, a spiral of dust rose from the center of the circle. Slow, cold, quiet, it hovered for a long moment. Then it drifted north. No one followed. They simply nodded. It would go where it was needed. The spiral was no longer something to witness. It was something to be. Some chose to form in its rhythm, planting by memory, not calendar. Others sang to water, and the rivers cleared. Those who worked with metal shaped it into tools that hummed before they touched the earth, warning them where not to dig. A new way had formed, not a utopia, not a role, a dance, and the smoke was its music. Across the mountains, on a night where no wind moved, a woman sat before a cold fire. She had never seen a spiral. She had never heard the stories. But she closed her eyes and listened, and the smoke rose, faint, glowing, shaped like a hand, then a wave, then a seed. She smiled. She didn't need to understand it. She felt its trust. The new earth did not rise. It unfolded from the inside, not as something different, but as something long remembered, waiting patiently to be known again. And the spiral spun on. It began not with a sound, but with a dream, a single child, born beneath trees that whispered whispered before rain, closed her eyes one night and saw the mountain breathe. Not metaphor, not memory. It rose and fell with a rhythm that echoed her chest. She woke weeping and did not know why. Across the sea, a herd of deer began moving in a perfect spiral before dawn, circling a still lake, never looking back. In the northern forest, birds abandoned the sky in silence, all perching on the same hillside. Wings folded, eyes open, the people felt it in their sleep. A new pulse, not violent, not urgent, but deep, as if the earth had turned a page in a story it had been writing for eons, and now waited to see who was listening. The dream spread. Some saw rivers flowing upward. Others walked barefoot through cities made of stone and bone, where each wall hummed with breath. Some heard drums that shook the sky, even as they slept beside silent fires. It was not prophecy, it was presence in motion. The planet had begun to speak, not through voice, through rhythm, through silence where rhythm had once been, through color where once was shadow, through animals turning their heads toward nothing and everything. The dancers gathered, but not to dance. They gathered to still. They placed hands on soil and let their pulses align. Some felt warmth, others saw spirals etched into the backs of their own eyelids. One boy, only 5 winters, whispered, "The stone is dreaming of water," and then a well opened where none had been. In distant deserts, winds began to carve messages into the dunes. Spirals, hands, seeds, in places where language had vanished, meaning returned, not as script, but as feeling too deep to name. And the smoke changed. It no longer simply rose. It circled, it echoed, it paused, as if waiting for consent. And when offered, a heartbeat, a gesture, a still gaze, it moved forward. The people understood. The spiral was no longer just memory. It was direction, a signal, not of what will be, but what could be. The future did not speak in facts. It hummed in questions, and those who stood still enough could feel the answer in the movement of clouds, the way roots twisted before a stone, the flicker of flame that leaned towards something unseen. Across the fields, children began to walk in patterns, shapes that matched ancient star maps, though they had never seen the sky charted. One girl, while washing her hands in a cold river, paused and said, "The water knows what we will need." And a week later, the rains came early, not once, again. Animals began arriving in unexpected places, wolves resting beside shepherds, birds nesting in doorways, snakes sleeping beside healers. No fear, no challenge, just presence. The earth was not warning, it was inviting, not commanding, remembering out loud. The dreamers now spoke little. Their nights were full of landscapes that had not yet formed, of names no language held, of decisions they had not made but already felt the shape of. The dancers of smoke began to notice a new pulse in the fires. When they moved, the smoke shimmered not only with what had been, but with what might be. Possibilities floated, like stars between embers, not futures, fragments, questions, choices. The field was listening, but more, it was answering, not with certainty, with invitation, with soft gravity pulling hearts toward new ways of walking. The spiral now reached into dreams, each having seen the same image, a tree growing upside down, roots in the sky, leaves in the soil. No one spoke for hours. They simply gathered around the fire and waited for the smoke to form. And when it rose, it curled into the shape of that same tree, upside down, then slowly turning, as if to say, both directions are true. The earth had never stopped speaking. Only now were the people finally remembering how to answer. Through silence, through motion, through the trust that not all knowing must be explained. And the smoke carried it all, not as message, but as moment, not as command, but as path. Where the spiral led now, no one could say, but everyone could feel it. They called it the still time, not because nothing moved, but because everything moved together. The wind, the roots, the hearts of those who listen, all pulse with the same rhythm, so perfectly aligned that no effort was needed, no intention spoken. The earth was not asleep, it was in breath. Inhale, pause, exhale. In that pause, something opened, not a doorway, a field, wide, warm, humming with memory and possibility. The smoke spiral, now so vast it could not be traced, entered the breath of the planet, not as something foreign, as something remembered. The fires burned lower, not dimmer, deeper. Each coal held a resonance that echoed across oceans, through the marrow of mountains, beneath rivers that had never been mapped. The dancers no longer danced. They became the motion. Their footsteps did not disturb the ground. They completed it. Their gestures did not shape flame. They listened to how it wished to shape itself, and the earth responded, not in miracles, in alignment. Trees bloomed in winter, not to defy the season, but to nourish the animals whose migration paths had shifted with the spiral. Storms arrived without fear, carving new valleys as if the land had chosen a new way to breathe. The people no longer feared these changes. They stood in them, moved with them, sang into them, and in this silent harmony, children began to be born different. They were not louder, not stronger. They were closer to the veil. From birth, they knew things they were never told. They reached out to birds and waited, and the birds came. They touched stone and hummed its shape. They looked into fire and spoke as if answering questions no one else had heard. These were not prophets, not chosen. They were what came after, remembering. Their dreams were not different from their waking hours. They walked in both with the same ease. They drew spirals in the air, and the smoke moved. They whispered songs never taught, and the rivers turned. Some said they had no fear. Others said they simply had no word for it. For them, there was no separation, no line between what was and what might be. The field of Earth's breath lived inside them, not as knowledge, as nature. The elders watched with awe, not to teach, to witness, and they began to understand that the role of memory was not to preserve the past, but to make space or what had never been possible before. These children, some born in stone huts, others in metal towers far away, all shared the same gaze. Deep, quiet, spiral shape. In one place, a newborn placed her hand on dry soil, and grass grew around her fingers before anyone had spoken her name. In another, twins dreamed the same shape every night, a circle within a circle, both turning in opposite opposite directions at the same time. The spiral had entered them before breath, not as destiny, as rhythm. The earth did not rise in celebration. It rested in itself. The still time was not a pause. It was an inhale held just before transformation, and the smoke rose. Not high, not far, but near. It circled the hearts of those present. It wrote itself into breath, into stone, into song, into skin. And those who listened could hear the next motion beginning. Not loud, not sudden, a tremble like first light on water. The world had become one great breath, and it was not done breathing. Asterisk, asterisk, there was no day when it changed. No announcement, no blaze of prophecy or trumpet in the sky. The new world did not arrive. It emerged like a breath that had always been held, now finally exhaled. The people did not become more. They became real, fully, quietly, not perfect, present. The old questions fell away. What comes after? What does it mean? Where are we going? None of them mattered, because they were already here. The earth did not ascend, it settled. The wind no longer whispered secrets, it laughed in the trees. The rivers no longer carried sorrow, they danced with weightless ease. The fire no longer burned to be seen, it warmed without expectation. And the smoke no longer rose to deliver memory. It hovered like breath between lovers, like mist above still waters, like song in the throat before the first note is sung. The children who had known no difference between dream and waking now walked among the people not as leaders, but as mirrors. They said things that felt like wind brushing the face of the soul. They touched strangers and left them silent for hours, smiling with the weightlessness of understanding. When they laughed, mountains echoed, not in sound, in vibration. The world answered not with obedience, but with joy. The dancers had long since stopped gathering in circles. Now they moved wherever they stood. Each blink, each breath, a prayer, a rhythm, a thread in the living tapestry of the planet. The breath of the earth did not pulse beneath them. It pulsed through them. The stones were no longer cold. They hummed like drums long buried, and those who sat still enough could feel stories moving through their spines. A woman laid her hand on a cliffside and wept, not for grief, but for reunion. She said only one thing. It never left, and everyone understood. The awakening was not an event. It was a remembering of something that had never ended. The spiral had not led them here. It had become them. A child born at the edge of a lake did not cry when touched by air. He exhaled slowly, and the sky turned a shade deeper, as if absorbing the sound of his breath. A boy on the other side of the world touched fire for the first time and said, "I know you." Then he kissed the flame, and it kissed him back, with warmth, not burn. The animals no longer hid. They moved freely, without fear, walking beside those who no longer saw them as other. A fox curled beside a man who had once hunted his kind. A crow landed on the shoulder of a woman who carried nothing but seeds. The world was not tame. It was understood. It did not need permission. It had been seen, and so it revealed itself. The mountains told stories through light. The sky changed colors not with time, but with emotion. Dreams became a language. Silence became truth. And the people, the ones who once danced to remember, to restore now danced because it was the most natural thing the body could do. Some danced only with their eyes, others with breath, others still simply walked in such a way that the stones beneath their feet whispered, "Thank you." In one place, a meadow where no village had ever stood, a girl sat with her palm pressed to the ground. She did not move for 3 days. When she rose, a spiral of fireflies circled her once, then flew in all directions. Days later, in distant valleys, flames flickered for no reason. Coals pulsed, smoke curled, and carried no message. Only the presence of what was, and that was enough. The spiral no longer taught. It had fulfilled its path. It had not saved. It had not punished. It had remembered itself into being, and now it rested, not in the sky, not in the soil, in the quiet behind laughter, in the stillness beneath dance, in the breath before song. The people knew now. The earth had never needed to awaken. It had always been awake, waiting only for someone to listen without needing to speak. And now, they listened and lived. And when the fires burned low at night, and the smoke rose slow and soft and shapeless, they no longer asked what it meant. They simply closed their eyes and smiled.